The city had been saved and would thrive again.
ESS.
Everyone, don't worry, everything is
Καλά.
We stopped
Ares!
I think I feel comfortable in saying that I'm a bit of a fan of the God of War series. I bought myself the God of War PS4 Pro, I treated myself to the Pandora's box edition of God of War 3, and in 2009 I won the Subculture Birmingham Halloween fancy dress competition dressed as Kratos. So yeah, I'm pretty keen. After recently considering playing through Ragnarok for the second time, but being put off by the obscene length of that thing, I realised that I hadn't played any of the Greek Saga games since I completed Ascension back when that came out in 2013. And now that I've figured out how to capture footage from my PS3, I realise that I can play all of those games on that one machine through a combination of HD remasters and PlayStation Store downloads. As I write this, the internet seems convinced that a Greek Saga re-release for modern systems is on the horizon, so I guess I could have waited a bit longer for that to come out, but then again, Sony are weird when it comes to PC releases, and I'm yet to be convinced that a PS5 is worthwhile purchase, so I imagine this will be my only way of experiencing these games for the foreseeable future. Coincidentally, I got the urge to revisit these games at the end of 2024 and start of 2025, which is just a few months off the 20th anniversary of the release of the original God of War game on the PS2, which I guess explains the re-release rumours. Of course, if that turns out to be true, then that means the big takeaway is that we're halfway towards that Bloodborne remaster that is definitely something they are willing and able to do. Regular visitors of this dingy and slightly damp little corner of YouTube will know that I'm a big fan of behind the scenes documentaries about video games. I love to see the decision making, the cutbacks, the compromises, the inspiration, the arguments, all that good stuff. In more recent times, we are seeing less of this, as the inspiration for big studio releases now is usually along the lines of, that game is popular, make our game like that. But in the olden days, when 420 pixels were more than enough, thank you very much, it was fairly common for games to include little documentaries on release. The God of War collection for PS3 contains HD remasters of God of War 1 and 2, and also bundles in all the extra features and behind the scenes goodness from those releases. I've only looked at the God of War 1 stuff for now, as that's all I'll be covering in this video, but the depth of these features is above and beyond what most developers would think to include. I'm sure all of these are on YouTube somewhere, and I do encourage anyone interested to go and watch them, if only to catch a glimpse of a much younger and beardless Cory Barlog. There's footage from cut levels, all sorts of different concept art, hints at possible future games that never happened or were changed somewhat, and even 3D models of cut enemies. Because developers were given more freedom back in those days, the story behind God of War's conception is a pretty straightforward one. David Jaffe wanted to make a large-scale cinematic action game that pushed the limits of both the levels of violence and brutality and the abilities of the PlayStation 2 hardware. The team at Sony Santa Monica Studios wanted to make a game that would make people think, this is what an action game should be like. And I'd argue that they succeeded in that. For the few years prior to its release, large parts of the gaming industry were trying to imitate the success of Halo, which I'm also doing a ranking series of at the moment, so like and subscribe to catch that. God of War gave them something else to take inspiration from for the next few years. Castlevania, Lords of Shadow, Heavenly Sword, Darksiders, and arguably the most famous example, Dante's Inferno, all take undeniable inspiration from this game, down to the blades on chains weapons types. Of course, this game could also be blamed for the increased inclusion of QuickTime events, but we'll get to that. For those new to this channel, first of all, welcome, sorry about the mess, take your shoes off. I will be playing through the series one game at a time, and building up a ranking list as we go. Not a tier list, because I'm not an indecisive coward. This is a list with 6 entries, room for each of the Greek Saga games. I won't be playing Betrayal because it's a mobile game, and as a 2D side-scroller, it's too different to rank alongside the others. I also won't be covering the Norse games because, again, they're too different. Yes, I know I put the RPG Assassin's Creed games in a list with all the others, but I need a break from big open world games for a while. I feel I should also mention that while this is the first game to be released, in the chronology of the story of these games, this would be the 3rd entry. However, I would recommend anyone who hasn't played these games before to start with this one, because there is a central narrative mystery that slowly unravels throughout the game, and every other release just assumes that you know about it. It also seems clear to me that this game was made without the specific intention of releasing any sequels, but they did keep it open for that if and when they decided to do so. As such, there are elements here that contradict or don't quite sit right with the larger canon of the series, and I will be discussing those later on, so consider this your first and final spoiler warning for the entire Greek saga. But before we get into all of that, I would just like to take a moment to thank the sponsors of this video, the all-powerful and generous channel members. Sasuke11457, John Foss, Nevada Cowboy, Unrated Gamers, Combat Medic 25, Scott Parker, Ahmed Rasiad Al-Farabi, the effervescent Neil Sparks, and Piyush Agravo. In return for helping me to reach my goal of one day being able to turn off adverts so that I can swear more without getting demonetized, members get credited in each video and get to watch them earlier than all you other plebs. There's only one tier at the moment, and it's as cheap as YouTube will let me set it, and I've started learning other languages in an attempt to find a word that properly conveys how grateful I am to you all. Bahut shukriya. Also, this time we've got a one-time only shout out to Deadweight for following the instructions in that last Halo video. Keep an eye out in future videos for any potential clues on how to maybe get a free shout out some other time. Or not, whatever, I'm not your mom, do what you want. The Greek saga has many little features that ended up being included in every game moving forward, and this first one even made it into the Norse saga too. We are greeted with a menu screen that features half of a face backed with fire. When we start a new game, I picked the normal difficulty by the way for those interested, the fire fades and we transition seamlessly into a cutscene that sets the scene. In a not uncommon twist, this scene is seemingly showing us the end of our hero's journey.
Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I ended up in this situation.
Luckily, a narrator interrupts and takes us back to 3 weeks later. Looking back on the game having completed it again, I feel like maybe the developers were hoping that we'd keep remembering how this story is going to end, so that when we see the great lengths Kratos is going through to achieve his goals, we know he is still somehow going to end up having given up entirely and seeing no other way out than to jump into some rocks face first. They maybe hoped we'd keep that in mind throughout our time with the game, but I wasn't thinking about it much while I was stabbing giants in their eye and ripping off the head of gorgons. The game proper opens up in what I still regard as one of the best opening levels in gaming history, serving as an excellent introduction and tease of the game you're about to experience. We open up onto a rain-lashed shipwreck under siege from some sort of undead soldiers that materialise from portals coming up from the ground. Now, it's important to note that if there are any 20th anniversary announcements or releases in 2025, they will likely be in March, which is when this game came out in North America. However, over here in Europe, we had to wait until early July. This is important because in March 2005 in Europe, Devil May Cry 3 came out. I was a fan of that series, and in the 3 or 4 months between Devil May Cry 3's launch and God of War coming out, I played the former more than a couple of times, after having played through the other games in the series more than once too. Except Devil May Cry 2, that was a one and done for me. I mention this because even as a little idiot back then, I remember noticing the similarities in the combat system between these two games. More often than not, you are locked into a battle arena by a glowing demon door until you kill everything. You have a score counter and can combine light and strong attacks to make combos. You can also juggle enemies in midair, and the combat generally looks pretty stylish. What made God of War stand out for me, and why I prefer this system over that of Devil May Cry, is the simplicity of it. I was never good enough to pull off half the combos in the Devil May Cry games, and even then the battle animations were about as easy to make out as a close-up of a Transformers sex scene. God of War, however, which you'll remember was trying to make action games more cinematic, pulls the camera back a little bit so you can see what's going on, and will add slow-mo effects to the ends of combos, coupled with your blades glowing with hellfire and exploding on impact. Devil May Cry felt like death by 1,000 cuts, whereas God of War feels like death by a sledgehammer made of fire. The Blades of Chaos are a stroke of genius in terms of weapon design, backed up by the fact that so many other games try to incorporate something similar. I wish I could remember my first time using them and whether I knew that these were no mere swords going into it. I remember there was a demo which covered this part of the game, which I played time and time again, and I think it let you play up until where you killed the first Hydra head. But when it comes to iconic weapons in gaming, for me this is up there with the gravity gun. This means that your default and frankly main weapon is a mid-ranged implement that usually means you can hit enemies before they can hit you. This is often countered by enemies being keen on jumping at your face, but it can't all be too easy, can it? As well as range, the blades also allow for good crowd control as they glide through the bodies of your enemies and through the mooks stood beside them. There is an auto-lock mechanic which I will complain about later, but quite often you can just face a general direction and start swinging, and you're almost guaranteed to hit something. You can also grab weaker enemies, though often you'll have to soften them up a bit first. This will let you either punch them a bit before stabbing them through the chest, swinging them round with your blade before launching them into their bodies, or just fucking rip them in half with your bare hands. I'll get properly into the combat a bit later on, but after a few waves of enemies we head below deck and have our first boss fight, which reveals that on top of all the zombie dudes trying to kill us, there's also a whopping great big Hydra to take care of too. Here we're taught about blocking, which will block most attacks, but if you block at the last second, you'll parry the attack and can pull off a quick riposte of either a big sweeping light attack or an overhead smash with the heavy. I forgot to mention, you can also dodge roll with the right analog stick, but some attacks cannot be dodged, like this Hydra in a narrow corridor, so a block is the only way to avoid damage. Then again, later on, some attacks can't be blocked either, but that's where the real challenge comes into play. Once this chap is taken care of, we are introduced to another mechanic, balancing beams. We'll only encounter these a handful of times throughout this journey, but they can be a bit of a roadblock later on. These ones though are pretty tame, and if you do fall off, you can just mash the X button to climb back up and have another go. If you take your eyes off the narrow planks for a few seconds, you'll notice several other Hydra heads in the background tearing apart other ships, and this is a recurring theme throughout the game. There are often little incidental details in the background for anyone paying attention that just add to the sense of scale that the devs really wanted to instill in this experience. After this section, you'll see a human actively block Kratos' path and telling him to stay away from him. He knows who Kratos is and what he's done, to the point where he'd rather take his chances alone on a sinking ship being attacked by the undead and a Hydra. We don't know anything about Kratos at this point, but apparently lots of other people do, and they aren't too keen on him. At this point we find our first blood chest, which is different from the health chest we opened earlier. There are 5 types of chest in God of War. Green chests that fill your health, blue chests that fill your magic, red chests that contain blood orbs, blank chests that usually contain stat upgrades but sometimes it's more blood, and big round chests that I can't show on YouTube. As well as being in red chests, blood orbs are dropped by enemies when you kill them, and this is your weapon upgrade currency. The blank ones will most often contain either a Gorgon Eye or a Phoenix Feather, and collecting 6 of these upgrades either your maximum health or your maximum magic. And these are usually a little bit more hidden than standard chests, but nothing too extreme. You don't have to do too much exploration to find all of these. In the next area we emerge to a horde, or flock, I think, of harpies attacking the ship's crew. This is our first flying enemy, so now is the best time to learn about aerial attacks. At this point you can hold the heavy attack button to launch an enemy and yourself into the air, where you can then attack at will, but later on you will upgrade your blades to have more attacks that let you launch and juggle the baddies. You can also pull airborne creatures out of the air and slam them into the ground, or if you grab a harpy while you're on the floor, you'll pin them to the ground with your foot and pull their wings off. I just want to take a moment here to talk about the level of violence in this game. Now, I don't remember there being anything quite like this at the time. It's funny looking back at old Mortal Kombat games and remembering that conservative types wanted to ban it for its gratuity. They must have absolutely fainted at the sight of some of these executions here, something that has continued into the Norse game. Pulling off execution moves could be likened to the fatalities of Mortal Kombat, now I mention it. You don't need to do them, but you want to see what sort of creative manner Kratos has in mind for ending the life of this particular type of creature. Whether you're pulling them apart with your bare hands, ripping their wings off, shoving your blades down their throat, or ripping off their bladed arms and cutting them in half with it, these are over the top, gratuitous, and, to my mind, incredibly satisfying. I don't know much about sound design, but I've heard that if it's done well, then you won't notice it, which suggests that bad sound design stands out so much more. I'd argue that God of War goes the other way, that the sound design is so good that I was regularly noticing it and how much it elevates the action on screen. The slams and explosions of finishing combos, the crackling thuds of just grabbing enemies, the wet explosions of heads being pulled off, the subtle choking sounds as you slowly force blades down the throat of giant angry bulls. I'll refer back to that mallet made of fire comparison I made earlier, because this game makes you feel like the burning hammer of, well, not Thor, I guess Hephaestus, but more angry and hate-filled. The documentary mentions that the devs wanted players to be able to express their most brutal of desires, and this is so hilariously brutal and impactful that I never got tired of it. This section on the ship also demonstrates Kratos' lack of care concerning collateral damage. With the harpies flying around overhead, you'll instinctively start swinging blades around, which will take out some of the crew who are just running for safety. You'll likely accidentally grab an innocent when trying to pull a harpy down from the sky, which will show Kratos murdering them to extract some health orbs. One could argue that this action builds into Kratos' character. Everything is expendable in pursuit of his goals. These people can only serve to heal him, so he has no issues with cracking them open for the healing orbs inside. We get another mini-boss encounter with another Hydra head, and this one showing off a wider range of its moveset. Once it's dead, we move through the wreckage and across more balancing beams, but this time there's a fork in the path. There aren't many alternative paths in this game, and nothing is too cleverly hidden, like I said, but they will often involve you taking a risk, be it a sketchy looking jump or through more enemies or traps, or in this case, more balancing. With maybe only one or two exceptions, I found that these were always worth taking the risks for, as they always contain some sort of upgrade resource. After this, we get our first save point. There are no autosaves here, this is a PS2 game after all. These are pretty regular, and there are other invisible checkpoints spread frequently for when you do die, but if you want to close down the game, you'll have to find one of these. I ended up using these at every opportunity because my PS3 has this weird quirk of having a shit disk drive, so occasionally it will just stop reading the disk and crashes. I literally have to hold the console at a 45-degree angle from the ground when I put the disc in, otherwise it just won't read it. This probably won't bother anyone else, but I guess this made me more relieved to see a save point than it would be if my console wasn't such a twat. We're also treated to a little cutscene here that adds a bit to the mystique of Kratos. This guy recognizes us and refers to us as the ghost of Sparta and begs for our help right before getting shot. So Kratos is someone to be feared, but is clearly known to be handy in a fight. No time for pondering though, as we have ranged enemies to be dealing with, and no ranged weaponry of our own. Here we are taught how to move boxes around, and that they can be used as cover from arrows. So we push a box to the platforms, providing us cover from their arrows and allowing us to climb up and take them out. After this, we find a locked door with a woman begging for help on the other side. Despite us having already smashed down several collapsed support beams, this wooden door is just too much for Kratos to get through, so we need to find the captain's key to gain access. We battle our way through more wreckages as the harpies and Hydra heads devastate everything around us, and we learn how to climb vertical surfaces. In this instance being the ship's rigging, but later on will exclusively be the side of cliffs, or a spinning tower of blades, but more on that later. You can still fight while climbing, though not nearly as fluidly as on the ground, which seems fair. Later on, these sections did become a bit annoying to me, as Kratos can easily have his attack animations interrupted, and when you're hanging onto the side of a rock, you're limited in your ability to get clear enough of enemies to start attacking them. Next, we encounter our first god door, this one belonging to Poseidon, who grants us an AoE lightning attack. I'll go into the different powers later on, but you end up with 4 of them that are each upgradable I think 3 times and share a magic meter that can be refilled by blue chests and killing certain monsters in specific ways. Again, I'll get into all that properly later. Each time you get a new power, you will be locked in a room with a few waves of enemies to play around with it, and I feel this is a missed opportunity to not give us unlimited magic during these sections. Let us have free reign with the power for just a minute or two so we can properly appreciate how valuable it is and let us properly get to grips with it. Now we finally find ourselves in front of the final boss of the area, the main Hydra head. We see him swallow the captain, who has the key to his quarters around his neck, and it then summons 2 other heads to help him out. I love the sound of this thing just screaming at you, which is emphasized by the bombastic backing track cutting out while he does it. Something I had to learn when playing the Souls games is that the music and animations are designed to intimidate you, to overwhelm your brain and your senses and make you panic a bit. The bosses in this game do that too, with their thunderous roars, huge animations, and on a scale that we just hadn't seen before this. We take out the boss by impaling the little heads to the deck and then climbing the mast to fight the main head, whose death causes all the little heads to explode. We then stroll down his throat to find the captain. Now this is a pretty famous scene from the series, where the captain thinks Kratos is there to save him, until Kratos lets him drop into the depths of the Dead Sea Serpent. Was this necessary? No. Does it contradict future scenes in this game where Kratos is trying to convince strangers that he's not that bad? Kinda. I mean, this guy isn't even in his way, he's just there, literally hanging out. Anyway, we get the key and go to save the screaming ladies, only to find a massacre that gives Kratos flashback and triggers his recurring nightmares. Back on his ship, after finishing some special cuddles with his good friends, Kratos storms the deck to have words with the goddess Athena. During this conversation, we learn that Kratos has been suffering with these nightmares for at least 10 years, which he's been doing so on the understanding that the gods will forgive his past and end his nightmares. Athena says that she has one last job for him, and it's only a little thing: kill Ares, the god of war. Ares is currently attacking Athena's city of Athens, and apparently Zeus has forbidden the gods from waging war on each other. I'm not sure why that doesn't include leveling each other's cities and murdering their followers, but whatever. Athena promises that Kratos will be forgiven if he can bring Ares down, and so he sets sail to Athens, which isn't actually on the coast, that's Piraeus, but whatever. So yeah, in terms of opening sections, I still think this is one of the all-time greats. We get a flavour of pretty much everything the game is going to throw at us. We fought different kinds of enemies, learned how to manipulate items to solve puzzles, and how to play with a cheeky power. We've also had to go at button mashing to match on-screen prompts, but we haven't had a proper QuickTime event yet, and that's where these two come in. I mentioned earlier that several things done in this game were included in every future game in the Greek saga, and some even survived into the Norse games. The next bit did not make it to Midgard, but does get more hilariously over the top as the Greek games go on. There are 2 of the 5th type of chest that I mentioned earlier beckoning Kratos back to bed, and if you jump on the bed, you get a QTE button prompt. The camera then focuses on a vase on the bedside table, and timed button prompts appear that make the special cuddling get more special, culminating in a smashed vase and a whole load of blood orbs erupting from the threesome. Yes, this whole thing is crass and immature, but it's so daft and stupid and unsexy that I can't imagine many people really having an issue with it. I'm only really mentioning it because I know how absurd these mini games get as the games go on, and I'm pretty sure this one is the most sensible of the lot. So we dock in Athens, and Kratos heads up to the deck as the camera pulls out to reveal the dockyards, again emphasising that sense of scale that the devs were going for. We battle our way through and soon meet the new enemy type, the Minotaurs. Most new enemies are introduced with an in-engine cutscene, and you'll usually have to kill one of them before more are then introduced. However, here you have 2 Minotaurs to contend with, and these guys, like all other enemies, will appear throughout the rest of the game with a different appearance to fit with their surroundings. These guys either come with giant hammers or huge axes, and they are not shy about blocking your attacks while delivering blows which cannot be blocked. Whittle down their health enough and a giant circle button prompt will appear over their heads, and pressing this in front of them will trigger the QTE finisher. For these guys, it's a simple button mashing to choke them on your fiery blades, and doing so will result in them dropping health orbs rather than just blood. Around the corner we come across the remains of a battle scene as the Athenians are being slaughtered throughout the city, and we meet another new enemy, the Cyclops. Weirdly, this chap doesn't get a cutscene, but it's a one-on-one fight that ends in a proper QTE. These QTEs are special, let's say, as while the amount and timing of the button presses remains consistent, the actual button you need to press changes. This means you've always got to pay attention because any of them could be any of the 4 face buttons. I've got more to say on this, but I'm going to talk properly about the combat in a bit, I swear, just sit tight. Maybe like and subscribe while you're waiting. The next section is something of a puzzle, a room full of stacked boxes that we need to get through. The camera swings up to a top-down angle and we need to break some boxes to reduce the stacks and open up our way out. I can imagine some people getting annoyed by the lack of camera control here, but I think the automated camera is pretty essential to the experience throughout this game. In this room, for example, it adds to the claustrophobia and also gives you a clue as to which way you should be heading. In the next room you'll climb a ladder, where the camera pulls back to reveal a corpse hanging from the rafters. Later in the game it will pull right back to show off the scale of your surroundings, and again really feeding into that cinematic quality that they wanted you to feel. Something that you just cannot do with a player-controlled or over-the-shoulder camera. In the next room we fight Medusa, who is really done a disservice here. Medusa, Queen of the Gorgons, doesn't even warrant her own health bar and is no less challenging than any of the multitude of Gorgons we decapitate throughout the rest of the game. I know there's a Gorgon boss fight in the next game, I think it's with Medusa's sister or something, but why was she wasted in this encounter? This could have been any Gorgon rather than the queen of her species and the only one most of us have ever heard of. Anyway, in a slightly recurring feature for the series, we rip her head off and use it as a weapon that lets us turn enemies into stone. And we also learn that killing Gorgons with a QTE will drop magic orbs to fill up our magic bar. Thinking about it, I guess this mechanic is sort of similar to the glory kills of the newer Doom games. Sure, you can just kill enemies normally, but there are tactical reasons to kill them with QTEs. We fight through some more buildings and climb across some walls, and we have a bit of rope hanging combat. I've never really enjoyed these bits, as you can't defend yourself and you have to kill the guys pretty much one at a time. I can't imagine any no-hit runs are possible with this game specifically because of these bits. This section also shows off the circular level design used throughout this game that I find helps to make these locations feel more real, as cliche as that sounds, rather than just video game levels. Eventually we come to the road to Athens, where we are met with an apparition of the Oracle of Athens, who Kratos immediately tries to sexually assault for some reason. She tells us to come find her at a temple where she will show us how to kill a god. We then ascend the stairs in a scene that would sell the cinematic intentions of this game to anyone not already convinced. The camera pans up and back as we move through the flowing drapes, opening to a scene of a giant Ares, stomping flat the city beneath him, arrows filling the sky around his ankles, and fires and fighting all around him. This is it. This is who you need to kill. Shadow of the Colossus wouldn't come out for another 7 months or so over here in Europe, so this was probably the biggest boss anyone had ever seen at this point. How the hell are we supposed to kill something that could wipe out an entire battalion just by sitting down? We fight our way through under siege streets and are introduced to a couple of other new mechanics. First is the pressure sensitive buttons that need to be weighed down to keep a gate open. This throws you in the deep end though, as there are no stones to drag over it. You need to lure an enemy onto the button, then freeze him with your Medusa power and then run through the gate before they break free. Soon after this we're introduced to the rope swinging mechanic, which I think only occurs 3 or 4 times in the entire game, and thank God for that, because these feel sketchy as hell to use. It feels like blind luck whether you're going to jump at the right time or in the right direction. After our quick swinging experience, we round the corner to Athens town square, with artillery destroying the buildings, harpies filling the skies, and civilians running for their life. There's also some Cyclops here to take down, and at this point I started really encountering what would become my biggest issues with the combat system in this game. So let's talk about combat. Roll the montage. I made some comparisons earlier between the combat in God of War and Devil May Cry. However, one big difference between the two is that while Devil May Cry has several weapons to choose from, God of War has 2. Now that said, the Blades of Chaos are surprisingly versatile, and once you upgrade them a few times you have quite a range of combos and attack styles. There are no cooldowns on abilities, so you can spam your spin attacks as much as you like to smash through blocking enemies, or you can roll around them and slash at their flanks. Maybe about a third of the way through the game you'll get another weapon, the Blade of Artemis. This thing comes with a full moveset unlocked from the go, and upgrades just increase its damage, which I found myself doing purely because the size and sound of this thing makes it sound a lot more powerful than it actually is, at least until you upgrade it into the melee shotgun that it really is. The thing is, all of that is late game stuff. In the early game, you won't have these things unlocked, and the lack of combos and abilities can make for some repetitive fighting. That feeling is not really helped by the spongy enemies, because goddamn, some of these dudes can take a battering. Other than the little undead guys, enemies can take several blades to the face without flinching, will block at a split second's notice, and will interrupt your attack animations like your mum's tickling interrupts my climax. And on top of all of that, in the big battles with several NPCs on screen, the automatic lock-on is about as useful as a chocolate teapot. A QuickTime event prompt will appear above an enemy's head, and you need to run up to it and press the button to trigger it. But if there's another enemy within the same sort of postcode, Kratos may decide to reach longingly out to that enemy instead, grabbing nothing but comforting Mediterranean air. I mean, look at this. I'm right in front of the guy, but the game thinks I'm trying to grab the big lad directly behind him, resulting in Kratos trying to hug his shins like some sort of confused and horny dog. I mentioned earlier that many areas, if not most of them now that I think about it, will pop up these demon firewall things that will only disappear once you've killed everything, and enemies will typically spawn in waves. Now that's all fine and dandy, but more often than not, I felt like there were 1 or 2 waves too many in these encounters. Oh, you've just killed 3 Minotaurs? Well, have another couple for fun. Oof, that pair of Cyclops seemed tricky. Have another couple to cool down with. This is all made worse by Kratos having about as much poise as a sheet of toilet paper in a tsunami. Particularly when the fight scenes get busy, one hit might be enough to knock you into a chain of knockdowns that see you helplessly whittle away your health and die, all because the big bad Spartan couldn't put a shirt on or something. So you've only got 2 weapons, but you also have those 4 powers I talked about earlier, which can really help you to get out of some tough situations. Poseidon gives you that AoE lightning attack, which can be upgraded to let you mash the button to prolong the damage. Then you get the Medusa head, which turns enemies to stone and will let you kill them with a heavy attack, and this can be upgraded to fire in bursts and in a 360-degree radius apparently, although I've never seen that for myself. Then you get Zeus's lightning bolt, acting as your only real ranged option, which can again be upgraded to do more damage. You'll get all of these within the first few hours of the game, but it's not until the last quarter, maybe, that you unlock the final and to my mind best power. Hades gives you the ability to summon souls to fight for you, and this is what I was saving up all my blood orbs for throughout my entire playthrough. Now, I've long been an advocate of New Game Plus. If a game has upgradable equipment and abilities, then to my mind, there should be a New Game Plus. I can't think of any games that wouldn't benefit from this. It lets players go on a bit of a rampaging lap of glory through the game they've just beaten. Some games up the difficulty for these runs, or change up enemy placements, or whatever, and yeah, I'm all for that, let's go. God of War does not have New Game Plus, and I have never been able to fully upgrade every ability and weapon in the game. That Army of Hades ability is incredibly expensive to upgrade, but it's so powerful compared to the others that the only other thing I was upgrading was the Blades of Chaos. Now, at the end of the game, like right at the end of the game, you can gather up a shit ton of blood orbs to upgrade your stuff with, and by the end I had maxed out the Blades of Chaos, Army of Hades and the Thunderbolts, and everything else was up to level 2. But by that point, all I had to do was beat the final boss. I mean, even during that boss fight, Ares, spoilers, drops more blood orbs than I ever had on me at any one time, but they're no use to me because I'm about to finish the game. And upgrading stuff itself is tedious. You acquire blood orbs that fill up a bar, and the bar rolls over when it's filled. For some reason, 1 bar equals 300 orbs, which I guess is fine, but when it tells me that I have 21 bars worth of blood, I don't know what that equates to because I'm shit at maths. Have 1 bar equal 1000 orbs and be done with it. Are Americans so scared of metric that they'll do anything to avoid grouping things into tens? When you have enough orbs, which is up to 10,000 for some of the top end upgrades, you have to hold the button down while all 10,000 orbs fill up the upgrade meter. A minor complaint, obviously, but such a weird decision that so many people had to sign off on for it to end up in the game. You do also unlock the Rage of the Gods ability once you upgrade the Blades of Chaos. This fills up every time you either hit or kill an enemy. I'm not sure, and this seemed to change. Now I think about it, I think it only increases on a hit during boss fights. Anyway, you activate this once the meter is full, and Kratos will do significantly more damage while taking significantly less, pulling off some cool and badass moves while sporting glowing eyes and an electrified head brush thing. I just wish you could turn this thing off once you're done. Instead, you need to deplete the thing entirely and start building it up again. I guess that's fine in theory, but in practice, you could leave it until you absolutely cannot survive without it, only to learn that you were on the last enemy anyway. Whoopsie. So yeah, I have some gripes with the combat, but for the most part I found it to be enjoyable and impactful, and the violent and satisfying execution moves are like little treats to keep you pushing forward. I think a lot of my complaints would be significantly lessened if the combat encounters just didn't go on for quite so long. Most encounters feel like they're about to end, and then they'll just throw another wave at you, seemingly out of spite. But then there's the camera. Oh bloody hell, that camera. I know I was bigging it up earlier for showing off all the cinematic camera angles, but there are times, not many admittedly, but enough times that the camera can go fuck a garden pond. So many games have had camera systems similar to this that change position at certain points. The biggest issue with this for players has always been orientation. Is it clear where I am relative to where I was and where I was going? An elegant solution to this that I've seen in the past is to have the player continue moving in the direction they were heading until they stop moving. So for instance, if the player was holding forward when the camera was behind them and suddenly jumps to a side-on view, the character will keep moving forward for as long as you hold that direction down. But if you move the stick in the same direction again, you will now move in that direction relative to the camera. Does that make sense? I'm not sure that makes sense, but that's the best I can do. God of War is not elegant. When the camera changes perspective, so do the controls. This can result in you jumping between camera angles as the direction you're telling Kratos to go changes without any input from yourself. Enemies can go suddenly from being very visible to being hidden behind a wall, and grab attacks can be made completely redundant as Kratos swings around with the camera to face the new forward direction. Again, this doesn't happen very often, but it is another problem with the combat system that can add up to some frustrating encounters. Especially those bloody harpies that like to hang around behind the camera, swooping in for some cheap attacks like those bloody eagles from Far Cry 4, that stupid piece of fucking... In terms of gameplay mechanics, that's pretty much all there is to God of War. As we keep heading towards the Temple of the Oracle, we meet enemies with shields that have to be broken with heavy attacks before you can damage them, and enemies that can tunnel through the ground to pop up and give you a quick bum stabbing that require changes in your tactics to deal with. This section across the rooftops of Athens does what I feel to be a really good job of showing the devastation of the city. The place is falling apart around you and is crawling with undead soldiers tearing people to pieces. We also encounter another person who recognises Kratos and wants nothing to do with him, something which he seems upset and almost hurt about. This is what I meant when I talked about the contradiction to him willingly dropping that chap down the Hydra's throat. If he cares this much about what strangers think of him, why is he choosing to throw dudes down dead esophaguses? In an action straight out of the book of How to Be an Absolute Bellend, Kratos follows the woman despite her running away and shouting no at him to the point where she falls off a balcony and dies. She lands back in the Athens town square we were fighting in earlier, and later on we will pass through here again to see it strewn with blood and debris. Again, I'm a big fan of this circular level design. You keep popping up in areas you've already visited, and each time it's a surprise and a bit of a novelty. We are gifted Zeus's lightning bolts that we need to kill a dude who is holding down a drawbridge to stop baddies coming to get him, and we eventually bump into the Oracle who is being kidnapped by some harpies who, helpfully, seem to be taking her to a temple, which is where she said she was anyway, so what's going on there, love? Outside the temple, we meet an old chap digging a grave who won't give us any straight answers. We'll talk about him later, but for now we fight our way into the temple and across a rooftop balancing beam section, which has the added novelty of sections falling away when you get close to them. In the gardens of the temple, we find the Oracle hanging from a rope calling for help, and we need to get up there to catch her. This is really just a timed climbing section between obstacles, but to get it started you need to get up to this high ledge. Now luckily I remembered that the solution is to drag a pillar down a lift and leave it next to the edge of the lift's platform, then get the other pillar and drop it on top of the first before moving them both down to the right spot to create a platform. I'm not sure how long that took me on my first playthrough or how well this solution is hinted at, but looking at it now it seems like a wild assumption to make, and moving pillars is such a slow process that trying different things is a huge time investment, so you want to be sure you've got the solution before dragging the thing across the level and trying out a hunch. Luckily, we save the Oracle, whose first instinct is to peer inside our innermost thoughts. There's a difference in cutscene style in this game, with many of them being in-engine, but the big important ones are pre-rendered. This isn't really something that you see these days because discs can hold so much more data than they could back in 2005, but back then this meant that the high quality cutscenes were reserved for the most important moments. Almost all of the pre-rendered cutscenes during God of War are building on the central mystery surrounding the game. Who is Kratos and why is he plagued by these nightmares? I tend to think of these as little rewards for completing sections of the game. At this point we know that Kratos was a general in the Spartan army whose brutality earned him the following of thousands of men, with his wife and mother of his daughter being the only person able to stand up to him. We also know that he has beef with Ares for what he did that night. The Oracle is pretty disgusted by what she sees in Kratos' mind and begrudgingly tells Kratos to go to the desert to find Pandora's box, the only thing that can kill a god. So, off we go to the desert, leaving Ares stamping around Athens without a care in the world. After we battle our way out of the city through the sewers and cross a really cool looking bridge that we'll see again later, we encounter our first spiral staircase camera angle. I think this comes up in every game in the Greek saga, so I'll be keeping a little counter as we go. This section in the desert has the unique aspect of having a really interesting concept, but in execution ends up being a big wet pile of wank. Are you familiar with sirens? Mythical creatures that lure sailors with their songs to cause them to crash their ships on the rocks? Well, imagine that, but it's in the desert during a sandstorm so you can't see past the range of your blades. The sirens keep wandering around all over the place, and 2 of the 3 you need to kill will spawn in other big bad spongy monsters when you attack them. Yeah, this bit sucks. God knows how you speedrun this nonsense. Again, it's a really good idea, just not executed well at all in my opinion. There's a combat section here where you have to push a block against a conveyor belt as enemies continuously spawn in around you. This isn't a unique encounter and happens a couple of other times throughout the game, but I feel like the spawning enemies are less of a challenge and more of an annoyance that needlessly and overly prolongs the encounter. We soon find ourselves with a horn that we can use to summon Kratos, Titan and the father of Zeus, who has been condemned to carry the Temple of Pandora on his back as he crawls through the desert for the rest of time. A cutscene shows Kratos climbing on the top of this huge bastard and apparently taking 3 days to reach the entrance to the temple itself, where an eternal watchman warns Kratos against entering, as no one has ever succeeded. If you talk to this chap after the cutscene, he tells you that he was the first to try and find Pandora's box, and his punishment for failure was to spend eternity outside the temple, burning the bodies of those that failed to find the box for themselves. The Temple of Pandora makes up the majority of the rest of the game. This is a twisted labyrinth full of deathly traps and incredibly pissed off and powerful monsters. To go through this place room by room would take me several hours, and there aren't really any new mechanics introduced. There are some standout moments though that I want to talk about, and the first thing is the design of the lower level of the temple. The temple is split into 2 sections, the upper and the lower makes up the largest portion of the temple by far. I mentioned the circular level design earlier. Well, this section is true of that in both meanings of the word. You can go off and learn how to swim underwater without breathing, past several challenges left by several gods, down long tunnels of death and destruction, and all of a sudden you'll end up back in the central section of the temple. This section is built around 2 huge round corridors surrounding themselves with the lift to the upper section in the middle. Your overall goal is to find the keys to 2 doors to allow a beam of light to travel from the outer edge of this area to the lift in the middle. But this is God of War, and we're in the Temple of Pandora, built to hide the one weapon that can destroy a god, so we can't just go and find a set of keys and try our luck. One puzzle room, or I guess challenge room, maybe both I guess, but one room I'd forgotten all about was one which contains a crank that we need to activate a mechanism elsewhere. You enter the room and the door slams shut as enemies start spawning in. Okay, no worries. Throughout this fight, the floor occasionally bounces upwards, like it's a door something is trying to break out of. Shortly after noticing this detail, I immediately forgot about it as I tried to get clever with dispatching the sirens. As I'm about to slam one of their faces into the ground, the floor opens up and I drop in for an instant death. Boo. This sort of thing happens a couple of times, where you know something is going to happen, but you can't be sure of what until you die from it. The next time something almost identical to this happens is much later on, where you get locked in a room and have to move a block around the corner while the ever-increasing sound of a gear mechanism gets quicker and quicker. I had thought that jumping on the block would save me from the floor spikes, but no, they smash the boulder and your private bits and you have to start all over again. That one is particularly well done though, because just before the spikes pop up, the mechanism noises stop along with any background music. So there's just a beat of total silence just before your instant death. Just long enough for my stomach to feel like it's dropped in terror. Not too far into our journey through the temple, we encounter this sloped room. At the top is a button that will cause 2 panels to surround it, and the nearby lever will cause these to spew fire from them. There's a note on the wall next to the dead soldier, who says that what he's being asked to do is too much, as these monsters were once men. We head back down to the bottom and drop down a cage containing a monster who is snarling and trying to break out and get Kratos. Kratos looks knowingly towards the fire panels and smirks at the monster, who realises what's about to happen and starts panicking, desperately trying to escape from his cage. The quote-unquote puzzle here is to get the cage with the monster in it to the top of the slope and offer them as sacrifice. Cool, no problem, except for the endlessly respawning monsters once again making this feel more tedious than it really needed to be. I'm sure this cage fella was once a man, but he seems pretty feral now, and I found the look Kratos gives him to be pretty funny. However, in what I assume to be just the original North American release, this scene is a whole different perspective. It isn't a feral monster in the cage, it's an Athenian soldier, thankful for being rescued and even offers to help Kratos escape and return to Athens. Kratos basically tells him bollocks and then drags him up there to die screaming in agony as he is engulfed by flames. I had no idea that this version of events existed until several years after release, and it does paint Kratos in a different light, I guess. Although thinking about it, there is similar stuff that was included in the second game, which is morally just as bad, but in practice has less screaming, so I guess the age rating board weren't as bothered about it. That does make me wonder though that if there is going to be a modern re-release of this game, which version will they use? Because we know companies don't put any effort into re-releases anymore, so they're hardly going to make 2 different versions, are they? I guess only time will tell, but place your bets now. Although I think the human sacrifice version is referenced in Valhalla, so it'll probably be that version that gets remastered. Still, if you want to bet on the feral monster version, I'll give you good odds. While you're off and about exploring this vast temple, there's a section in particular that sees you scaling the cliffs around the outside of the structure. At this point, the camera pulls back just a bit and angles itself so that you can see Kronos far beneath you, still crawling along the desert sands, reminding you that you may be inside a temple built into the side of a mountain, but that mountain is being carried by a dude who, spoilers, you'll later find out is your uncle. Again, the sense of scale this game is able to pull off on the PS2 is phenomenal, and you can see why most of the gaming industry tried to emulate these sort of impactful visuals. We soon get the ability to breathe underwater, and luckily these are underwater sections that aren't a complete and total pain in the arse to navigate. Although there is one section where you have to outrun a speeding wall of death that I felt I fluked it rather than getting my timing down, though this is balanced by one of my most memorable scenes in this game, where the cylindrical tube you find yourself swimming through starts closing in from all directions, and you have to dash your way through to the other side before you get Iron Maidened. It's still pretty tense to this day, but I'd completely forgotten that you then have to do it again coming from the other side. Honestly, there are so many memorable rooms and set pieces throughout this game that I feel like I'm doing the game a disservice by not going into all of them in more detail, but I'd end up talking about it longer than it took me to get through them, so I just have to keep looping footage round and round while I blather on about how brilliant the Atlas globe throwing bit is or whatever. One memorable room I did want to gush about for a bit is the Hades room. We start off in a room with nothing in it except a big corridor at the other end which is too dark to go through because apparently Kratos is afraid of the dark. So we need to brighten up the place. Step 1 of this is to be introduced to the Centaur enemy type and kill 8 of them within 2 circles. This was a massive pain in the ass because the non-fatal finisher throws them away from you and these guys run around a lot and can shove you back, so actually landing the killing blow within one of these spots was a bit of a pain in the ass. They also managed to stunlock me while shoving me back, draining my health and preventing me from fighting back too much to avoid killing them outside the circle. Next, you have to fight your way through a maze area, which you could only escape by killing absolutely everyone inside it, which I had to repeat because I thought I glitched into this little room and couldn't get back out. Turns out every third time this block moves, it moves back further. Who knew? Loads of people, actually. Getting through this triggers this frankly badass cutscene where a statue of Hades rises up from the pool of blood in the middle of the main room. It's short and simple, but I just love the imagery of it, being about as subtle as a sledgehammer to the bollocks. The head of this statue contains a light, which we can turn to face the dark corridor that Kratos is scared of, only to see something much more terrifying. A huge corridor full of giant lava boulders rolling down it. When I'm making videos, I try not to watch any other videos on the same topic, mostly because I want my experience to be untainted by other people's opinions and perspectives. However, I can imagine that pretty much any video discussing this game will have the same opinion I do about this bit, because if anyone thought this was good, or if anyone got it without reading the notes at the end, then they're a liar and you shouldn't trust them. This corridor is lined with doors. Now apparently ancient Greece wasn't big on hinges, so doors are all made out of stone and have to be lifted vertically. Actually, before we go on to it, I just want to sit on this for a bit. Opening doors requires you to mash the R2 button. Now as I was playing this on the PS3 using a DualShock 3, this took a bit more effort than it would on the PS2 thanks to the L2 and R2 buttons having more of a hinge design to them, making the act of rapidly mashing it a little bit more tiring. Plus I'm 20 years older now, my joints hurt. But you also have to mash the circle button to stab Minotaurs in the throat, among other things, and when enemies jump on you or turn you into stone, you have to wobble the left analog stick as quickly as possible. Now this is probably just me, but I found this difficult to do with just one finger. Similarly to A Night With Your Mom, I ended up having to flip the controller around and use a slapping or waving motion, or use the back of my fingernail over the buttons to win the little QTE events. Was it always this hard, or am I just getting older? Anyway, the doors. On my way up the corridor, I spent a bit of time figuring out the pattern of the boulders, as the window of opportunity is incredibly tight to open a door without getting hit. I got bounced into a doorway just after I opened it to find nothing, so I decided bollocks to the others, the rewards can't be worth the health or lose trying to open them. I make my way to the end of the corridor and the safety of the room beneath the ramp, only to find a note telling me that one of the doors is the way out, but all the others have got fuck all in them. Damn whoever came up with this challenge. Damn whoever agreed with them. Damn whoever wrote the code for it. The documentary says they play tested this game extensively, so damn whoever tested this. Damn them, their mothers' mothers, and their dogs, their cats, their children, and their houseplants. May all their cold drinks be forever warm, and all their hot drinks be forever cold. Fuck them, is what I'm saying. I mean, I managed it like I managed it when I played the game years ago, but I don't think it ever felt like anything more than just a fluke that I actually opened the door in time. The timing has to be so precise, and you spend so much time dodging boulders waiting for a gap that you end up out of line with the door, so you have to wait for the next go around to have a go at it. Ugh. With all of that said though, I didn't actually die in that corridor of death and wrongly temperatured drinks. This next bit though caused me to die so much that the game offered to drop the difficulty down to easy, though it does admit that this would only affect the combat, and it wasn't the combat that was killing me. Has anyone here ever heard of Sen's Fortress? Has anyone heard of the rafters in Anor Londo? Well, imagine those had a baby which they then neglected, causing it to grow up with trust issues and a history of drug abuse, and you've got this section. In hindsight, it's not actually that bad, I was just being particularly shit that morning when I played it. You're now directly above that album cover worthy Hades statue balancing precariously on narrow beams. Thing is that there are also spinning arms covered in blades crossing those beams, and you need to time your crossing and jump over them as they approach to make it to the other side. Again, probably not a problem with someone who is any good at these things, but it gave me more trouble than that Hades level, which I'll get to, don't worry, it's coming. First though, we've got another boss fight. Yeah, boss fights. Remember those? God of War did, eventually. That Hydra in the first level was the last boss we faced, and now we're probably 2/3 of the way through the game, maybe even more than that, but we've got another one at last. Still, I suppose it's better than having lots of bosses that are just different coloured reskins. Wouldn't that be a letdown? It's such a cinematic action-adventure experience. I kinda feel though, as we've waited this long, we could have maybe waited a little bit longer and had this be the guardian of Pandora's box, the final challenge standing in the way of our destiny. But no, this guy, the strongest entity inside the entire temple, the only other thing so powerful that it needed to be locked away, is the sacred guardian of the key you need to open the second door to the lift that gets you to the upper levels of the temple. I'm sure his mother's very proud of him. So I quite like this boss fight. You have to use a combination of blocking and rolling to avoid damage, and he regularly spews health and magic orbs to keep you going. It also has an aspect that I don't think I've seen before or since, where you can change the style of the boss fight at any time. You can run up onto this platform and fight him in a sort of 2D style boss fight, where you dodge his giant fists and attack his big fat head in between his strikes, or you can run down to his level and have more of a 3D fight with him, where his attacks will be different. I personally found it easier to handle him in the 2D setting, so I stayed up top and took that bitch to school. As you damage him, part of his armor will start leaking steam, at least I assume it's steam, and every time it starts leaking out of another hole, he'll run to the back of the room before charging into the platform, kicking up fire and damaging you. It's also worth noting that this platform contains a mechanism that fires giant wooden stakes across the room. Once he's spewing enough steam, he'll run to the back of the room and cower into a ball, with a QTE prompt appearing above his head. The problem is that this will only be there for a couple of seconds before he gets back up, so while you can choose to fight him here on this platform, you will never be able to beat him because you need to be close enough to trigger the QTE, which stuns him into standing up long enough for you to run back to the platform and fire a stake at him. Once you do nail him with your big bit of hot wood, the armor encasing his health bar has started to crack, but you still can't damage him directly. Do the same thing again, hitting him until he spits out enough steam and then QTE him before launching a stake at him, and that armor becomes even more cracked. Now though, instead of leaking steam, chunks of his armor fall off as you fight him, both the actual Minotaur and off his health bar. Once all the armor has been destroyed, fight him again until he's stunned, which doesn't require a QTE this time. Stroll back to the lever and impale his scrawny, sinewy body to the wall. In his death throes, he'll luckily boot a hole in the door so we can get through and get the next key that we need. Hooray! Again, good boss fight, but they could have just added another QTE we could trigger at the platform, then you'd have a boss fight that you could choose the style of. Again, something I don't think I've seen before or since in any game, but do feel free to correct me. On the way back out of this room, we get our final power, the Army of Hades. Going into this game, I remembered that this was by far the most powerful and useful ability, so I had deliberately not upgraded any other abilities throughout my entire playthrough. I had been upgrading the Blades of Chaos, and I did pump the Artemis Blade up a level because that does seem to be more difficult for enemies to block, but now I had what I had been waiting for. This takes a good chunk of magic to use, but it summons ethereal spirits that basically do massive unblockable damage to everything around you. 3 Cyclops and some soldiers giving you grief? Just summon these chaps and they'll pretty much take care of it themselves. Higher levels just increase the damage these things do, and I'm glad I saved up for this because there's a particular encounter later on which would have been a bigger pain in the arse to deal with without this. We can now ascend to the upper levels of the temple, and Athena warns us that we will not be able to return to the lower levels once we take the lift. The only thing worth sticking around for is the Muse's room. The central part of the temple can be rotated, igniting Kratos' interest in changing the orientation of temples using brute force. Hidden in this layout is a locked door that requires 2 Muse keys, which are in different chests off the beaten path, one in the cliffs where you can see Kronos beneath, and another one in a side path in the underwater sections. I remember it took me until maybe my third or so playthrough back in the day until I found both of these keys, and I do remember a sense of wonder when I finally opened the door to witness the treasures within. Your rewards are a big dollop of blood orbs and a health and magic meter upgrade, pretty useful stuff and worth the very slight side tracking needed to unlock them. I remember the presentation of the room striking me when I first found this though. This was before YouTube was really a thing, so I hadn't seen this before, but the giant heads looking down on me and the twinkling effect throughout the secret chamber really impacted me. Such a small little detail, but one that clearly left an impression. But anyway, enough of all that, we still have a temple to conquer. The upper temple section is much shorter than the lower and consists of more traps and so-called puzzles. I see people referring to these encounters as puzzles, but you won't need any critical thinking skills to solve these. The most difficult one is a Tetris style puzzle where you have to fill in a wall with stone Tetris pieces, with the most challenging aspect being how long it takes to move the pieces around. Most of the puzzles are really just timed challenges, pull the lever and get to the door before it closes. The most challenging part of this specific puzzle, for example, was jumping back over the moving platforms and between the blades with the camera pointing in the wrong direction. Luckily that bit isn't timed, but I had more trouble getting over this way than I did when under the timed pressure. Throughout our journey through the temple, we've also encountered a few new enemy types, like these Cerberus baby dogs, which eventually turn into big giant dogs if you don't kill them quick enough, and this other fellow, which feels very Egyptian in appearance to me. Maybe it's the blue stripes. We also get a flashback that shows Kratos selling his soul to Ares in exchange for saving his life from a barbarian attack, with Ares searing the blades of chaos to his flesh as a constant reminder of his servitude. Later on, another flashback shows Kratos leading a pillaging of a town loyal to Athena, with an oracle warning Kratos about entering the temple. We see him cut down everyone inside, but collapsing in horror at the sight of his final victims, which I think at this point most people would have figured out what the big reveal is going to be. I can't remember a time not knowing what the big reveal was here, so I can't remember when I figured it out for myself, although to be fair it probably wasn't here. I've never been good at putting things together, certainly not 20 years ago. After our second spiral staircase camera angle, told you I'd be keeping count, we push through to the final challenge standing between us and Pandora's box. A huge room with a floor made of alternating conveyor belts with rolling spikes at the end and repeatedly respawning archers and harpies. This room is a pain in the ass and there are about 20 waves too many. Luckily, the army of Hades made this a lot easier to get through because those harpies can fly around behind the camera and sometimes they will spawn in too far away from you to attack, so you're left hopping around trying to get them to attack you just so you can see them. And you can't stand on a platform and wait for them because you only get a few seconds until the wall spits fire at you for loitering. Apparently they started designing a final boss for this, an actual guardian of Pandora's box. According to one of the behind the scenes videos, it was supposed to be some sort of giant bird that you would lure around the arena by breaking its eggs. They eventually dropped it though, the idea, not the eggs, and instead we got this. I still think they should have moved the Minotaur fight to here though, but there you go, I'm 20 years too late for that suggestion, I guess. With everyone in this horrible room dead, we can move through and finally get our hands on Pandora's box, which now I've said out loud, I'm wondering if there's an adult film about the box of a lady called Pandora and people being keen on opening it. The floor of the room descends and we end up back in the lobby of the temple that we passed through hours ago. I kind of love this bit and I do remember being confused here on my first playthrough. You've done it. You've done what no mortal has ever done and acquired Pandora's box. Now you just need to get it back to Athens, just down this mountain, strapped to the back of a titan, through the desert and into the city. The thing is huge and heavy and Kratos has to slowly push it along the ground, so I do remember thinking I was doing something wrong at this point. That didn't last long though, because Ares' spider sense starts a-tingling and launches a stone pillar across the desert and through Kratos' chest, killing him. After all he's just been through, it took a lucky throw from over the horizon to put an end to his journey. Or does it? Dun dun dun! I really enjoyed Pandora's Temple. I love the looping level design. I think the puzzles or challenges are for the most part pretty decent. The sense of scale is immense and there's a narrative running through the whole thing for anyone paying attention to the notes. You can regularly find notes from Pathos Verdes III, chief architect of the temple and loyal subject of the gods. At least he starts off loyal. Those 2 keys we needed to find to access the central lift, those are the skulls of his sons, both of whom died while helping their father build the temple. His youngest son was the first to die, which Pathos sees as a sacrifice to the will of the gods. By the time we get to the resting place of his eldest son, Pathos has started to question the gods and his purpose, no longer signing his notes as either chief architect or loyal subject. There are other notes dotted around that see Pathos questioning his life's work, until near the end of the temple we open the door to what seems like his workshop, with 2 corpses sat at a table, one hunched over dead and the other with a blade through its chest. This is Pathos and his wife. He snapped and killed her when she tried to stop him from working on the temple, telling him that both he and the gods were fools, so he killed her where she sat before taking his own life. Well, not exactly, because her skull is the key to the door out of that room that leads to Pandora's box, so I guess he killed her, built this bullshit room and the lift that takes Pandora's box down to the ground floor, then made the door lock that fits her skull, and then killed himself. I suppose we can't really question the logic. I mean, he was a bit bonkers after all. Now, it would be pretty ballsy to end the game here, with Kratos being killed by impalement after succeeding in his impossible task. But it would also be a disappointing ending for the game, and in a universe where death is just the next part of existence after life, Kratos decides that he just isn't ready to die yet. We've already seen that he won't take no for an answer, so he decides to climb his way out of Hades. Not without being a dick to this guy again for no good reason. I mean, technically that guy has just saved your life, or your soul, or whatever, because we're already dead. But Kratos is a badass who don't give no fucks.
Nasty, violent, antisocial, pissed off, angry, fuck you.
So he damns this guy for eternity. Also, I guess the implication here is either this guy has been hanging on to this giant spine since we dropped him down the Hydra's throat, or it took him all this time to die slowly in the rotting belly of a sea serpent and he's only just got here. Before Kratos succumbs to death and falls into Hades, he sees the Harpies carry Pandora's box back to Athens to give to Ares, as the final part of Kratos' mystery flashes before his eyes. It turns out that Ares had orchestrated events to place Kratos' wife and child in the temple of Athena, while Kratos believed them to be safe back in Sparta. Ares doesn't shy away from talking to Kratos about this, saying that this needed to happen to get rid of the only thing holding Kratos back from being the best darn champion of Ares that he could be. Kratos just doesn't see it that way though, and instead of embracing this new employment opportunity, he swears bloody vengeance. As he leaves the temple, the town oracle fuses the ashes of his murdered family to his skin as a constant reminder to himself and everyone else about the horrible things he has done, giving him the moniker of the Ghost of Sparta. That's pretty dark, right? And something that I think people easily forget when they talk about Kratos as a character. The remains of the wife and daughter that he murdered is literally fused to his skin for all time. That's going to come up in conversations. Faye must have known about this. I wonder if Atreus ever asked why he's so pale. That sort of thing is going to cause a bit of trauma moving forward in life. With the big mystery now revealed and fully understanding why Kratos is so motivated to kill Ares and stop his nightmares, we start our climb out of Hades. I remember this bit being notorious when it came out, because the whole section is slightly too long and repetitive fights broken up with platforming, rotating balancing beams with blades on them, and 2 of these spiky towers. I haven't touched on the platforming yet because I wanted to talk about it here, but there are some instant death jumping sections throughout this game. Which is fine in itself. Kratos has a double jump and it's usually fairly obvious whether you can clear a gap or not. The problem I had is that Kratos just feels too imprecise when he's in the air. If you change direction, he can easily overcorrect and head away from the platform and into oblivion, and especially when jumping between swinging ropes. Again, I honestly felt more like I got lucky when I succeeded, rather than feeling like I got a good handle on the controls and bested that challenge. So this whole section is like an ultra-violent Sen's Fortress, but made out of meat. The visual design of this section is a bit uninspired, I guess. Then again, it feels very appropriate for a late 90s / early 2000s depiction of hell. It's all blood and guts and exposed muscle and pulsating fleshy textures. Frankly, it felt a bit like an edgy teenager's vision of hell from back then, and it doesn't feel any more visually interesting going back to it now. I do like the fact that you keep seeing bodies falling into the river Styx below as their screams cut in and out as you navigate the platforms. But the main feature here is the spinning blades that branch off into different paths, really making you be sure that you actually want to explore rather than just stick to the critical path. On reflection, I didn't find these bits too hard. The beams regularly slow down their rotation and you can clear across most of them before they get back up to full speed, and you are rewarded with huge amounts of blood orbs to upgrade your abilities, which would have been more appreciated earlier when we would have had more opportunity to play around with these upgrades, but whatever. The big challenge here I remember everyone complaining about on release were these two spinning towers that you have to climb. And yeah, they're a bit annoying. By the time you realise that you're going to get hit, there's usually nothing you can do about it, and you'll be sent tumbling back down to start again. This is made worse by the inconsistent hitboxes of the blades. You can't tell, or at least I couldn't tell, whether I was close enough to get hit or not, as this seemed to be different for different blades. As annoying as it was, looking back at the footage, it only took me 8 minutes to climb both towers and do the little fight between them. It only took me 2 minutes to get up the first tower, but once I got up to the top, I started pissing about and then fell off the fucking thing, so I had to climb the whole way up again. Don't be like me. Be better. After some more fighting and platforming, we find a rope dropping down to us from the sky, and we climb up it to find ourselves emerging from the grave outside of the Oracle's temple in Athens that we passed by earlier. I'm pretty sure this chap pops up again in one of the PSP games, but all he will tell us for now is that there is more than one god looking out for us, and then he disappears into thin air. We fight our way through the now ruined temple, get a few more blood orbs to upgrade with, and then emerge out onto the cliffs, ready for our final showdown. Compared to game series like, say, Half-Life or Dark Souls, the story of God of War is incredibly straightforward, and other than that gravedigger chap, there's no real overarching mysteries, none that I can remember at this point anyway. As such, I've never really gone on a deep dive of speculation videos like I have with those other series. I never felt that there were any mysteries worth exploring. I mean, there is that one about who blew the horn in God of War 2018, but it doesn't seem like we'll ever get an answer to that one, and I think the devs would prefer if we'd stop asking about it. So while I haven't watched many essays or anything on this game, I have seen enough to know that most people generally hate this final boss, though off the top of my head I can't really remember exactly what they have an issue with. One issue I had is that my PS3 crashed when I completed the first phase, so I had to do the whole phase again and had to watch the cutscene, which I then learned is unskippable. It's unpausable too, in case you were wondering, and if they are going to remaster these games, then they really should add a pause and skip option to the cutscenes. Anyway, the boss encounter starts with Ares chatting shit to Zeus about how badass he is and he deserves a cuddle at long last. Kratos finally opens Pandora's box, the one thing that can actually kill a god, something we've been working towards this whole time. What sort of weapon or power could it possibly contain that would allow us to— oh, it just makes us big. Wow. How long do you think they sat around the table until they decided that that was the best they could do? I know God of War 3 recontextualizes this, but in 2005 that didn't exist. In 2005, the gods had commissioned a temple to be built into a portable mountain to contain a box that would make people big. Brilliant. Anyway, we now have a big kaiju fight with Ares, whose visual design I've never quite been able to get on board with. I guess his hair is supposed to be fire or something, but it looks more like a typical neckbeard experimenting with fluorescent orange dye to try and impress the cybergoth girl next door. So this first phase of the fight is pretty straightforward, except now you're as big as Ares. I do like that you can see tiny little ant people running for cover in the surrounding environment. You'd be forgiven for missing this detail because you're in a boss fight, but it's a cool detail that adds to the scale of what's happening. I didn't find Ares too challenging during this fight, as he telegraphs his attacks fairly clearly and most of them can be blocked, though I could never find the right timing to pull off a riposte. Once you wear him down, we move on to phase 2, emotional battery and public humiliation. We get teleported into a dream reality, I guess, where Kratos is faced with the temple of Athena in which he murdered his family, where Ares will make Kratos relive this trauma to emotionally beat him into submission. This manifests as several other Kratoses spawning in to try and kill his wife and child, and you have to defend them. They have their own health bar which you can top up by hugging them, transferring your life to keep them going. I like this concept and mechanic, but like the other fights, I feel like it went on for just too long. I ended up becoming frustrated with the auto lock on as I would try to heal the family, but ended up performing a finisher on a nearby Kratos. Luckily, the army of Hades pretty much carried me through this encounter and gave me some breathing room. Once the waves of enemies stops, Ares pulls the blades of chaos off Kratos after 10 years of them being seared to his flesh, which must have stung, and uses them to kill his wife and child again. He also strips Kratos of his magic, leaving him without weapons or powers to defend himself with. Feeling like he's worn him down enough, Ares snaps Kratos back to reality to face his final demise, only for Kratos to spot a giant sword being held by a statue, something that had formed an impressive but seemingly inconsequential bit of environmental design way back near the start of the game. Now the final phase starts, and I may be wrong here, but I imagine that this is the part of the boss fight that people generally don't like. Kratos has no powers and only this sword as a weapon, which I think has the same moveset as the Blades of Artemis. The twist here is that both you and Ares share a health bar. Damage Ares and your health increases as much as his decreases, and vice versa. I've always liked this mechanic, and I still do now. It means you can't get lucky and just scrape by. You have to dominate the God of War and beat him into submission. It can't come down to the wire. You just have to learn his telegraphs, block the attacks, and crack off the QTEs when you can and absolutely humiliate this chap. This feels appropriate given everything Kratos and we the players have been through to get to this point, and it adds to the following cutscene where Ares was clearly not prepared for this and is almost pleading to be spared. He wouldn't be appealing to Kratos to spare him if it had been a close fight. He got wrecked, son. He's shocked and facing death for the first time in his existence. Kratos isn't the forgiving type though, if there was any doubt about that, and runs him through with his blade. A mortal has killed a god, and Kratos has completed his duty to the gods of Olympus. Except not quite. In an example of why you really should read the small print on things, Athena reveals that she never said she would stop his nightmares. Kratos has done some messed up shit, so letting him forget that just wouldn't sit right. But they do forgive him for it. When this fails to give Kratos the fuzzy wuzzies in his tummy tum, he ends up back at the top of the cliff where we started this story and throws himself off. As he hits the water, Athena pulls him out, explaining that they want him to take Ares' place as the god of war. We get a cool scene where we stroll into Olympus and take our throne, where we are told that Kratos spends the rest of time as soldiers up to the modern day charge into battle in the name of Kratos, the god of war. The end. Playing this game after remembering roughly what happens in the other games, it's clear that this was made as a standalone story that could be expanded on in the future. Here's one last spoiler warning for the rest of the Greek saga, but there are elements of this game that just don't sit with the events of the rest of the series. Hades gives Kratos the ability to summon part of his army in order to help him in a fight, despite Kratos having killed his wife. The visual design of the gods changes dramatically as well between this game and all the others. Hades especially, going from some sort of satanic sex doll to an overweight S&M enthusiast. Zeus is also keen to help Kratos here too, despite it being revealed that Zeus knows Kratos is destined to destroy him. Though to be fair, this is hinted at a little bit in this game. There's probably some other stuff as well that might become more clear as I replay the rest of the games. And this isn't really a complaint, but it is another reason for newcomers to the series to play this one first rather than in chronological order, because otherwise parts of this could be a bit confusing. I would very happily recommend this game to anyone even remotely interested. I do think some of the enemies can take a bit too much damage and are thrown at you in just a few too many waves. Part of me wonders if they were trying to make it feel like you're just scraping through, like the challenge is so great that Kratos only just manages to overcome these odds. That almost sounds like a deliberate choice, but it could also very easily be that they just ran out of time to balance the game properly before release, and this came out back before patches were a thing on consoles. Other than a few little problems with the combat, like the crap auto lock and slightly too spongy enemies and slightly too many waves of them, I think it's a great experience, despite the relatively limited range of weapons. The Blades of Chaos feel consistently great to use, in a combination of animation and sound design, and the finishers are like little rewards to keep you looking forward to fighting new enemies. The game is bursting at the seams with memorable encounters and environments, and is a gloriously violent interpretation of the Greek myths that many of us grew up reading about. Taking this game as an isolated experience, I think the character of Kratos is revealed expertly. We are left guessing as to how he became who he is and why everyone seems horrified to meet him. Future games add to his character and flesh him out a bit more from what I remember, and while this would still be a really good game if no others were ever made, I think it works better as part 1 of the story of Kratos, or part 3 depending on how you count the other games. So this obviously goes in the top spot on the ranking list for now, because that's all there is at this point. Jesus Christ, this video has been an incredibly long one. I'd hoped to be able to keep these videos shorter, but there's just so much to talk about in this game. Please do like and subscribe if you want to see the rest of the ranking series, or indeed any of my other series. I'm working my way through the Halo series for the first time ever alongside the God of War games, so go and check that out if you're a fan of console exclusive sci-fi shooters. I'll be playing through these games in release order rather than chronological, which means the next one I'll be covering is God of War 2, one which always sticks out in my mind as my favourite, but I haven't played it since, when did the HD remasters come out? 2009. Probably since then, which would be about 16 years. Wow, isn't the passage of time terrifying? Anyway, I haven't played it in quite a long time, so I'm interested to see if it's still as good as my age-addled brain tells me it is. Well done for making it this far. If you're still here, please do leave a like if you haven't wanted to top yourself at any point during this video, and maybe consider subscribing, as I'm told that helps the channel. However, if you haven't enjoyed the video, then, well, I guess you need to learn to know when to stop doing things that you aren't enjoying. Seriously, life is too short for hate watching. Do something you do like instead.